And it's a huge advantage if you have somebody who can be recognised as that.
And so we literally came back from school, climbed on our pony.
Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the palace, a whisper carried a storm, aimed straight at Princess Charlotte. And Princess Anne felt it before she saw it. In the grand corridors of royalty, even the smallest of murmurs can signal disaster. And this one struck her like a chill in her bones. The event was supposed to be nothing more than a gentle unveiling of Charlotte's poise. A quiet family moment meant to introduce the young princess to her future audience without spectacle or pressure. But Anne had lived long enough within these walls to know that nothing inside them was ever truly innocent. What began as a graceful plan soon showed the fingerprints of something darker. Rumors snaked their way to Anne's ears, hushed but insistent, that Queen Camilla's loyalists had been whispering about an interesting twist for Charlotte's big moment. The words were vague enough to deny, but heavy enough to plant doubt in Anne's mind. She tried to dismiss them at first, unwilling to believe that even in this family, anyone would dare turn a child's first steps into a trap. But then came the subtle, insidious, undeniable details. Anne began noticing slight alterations in the carefully orchestrated plans. The seating chart, once perfectly arranged to keep Charlotte nestled between her parents, now placed her several seats away, exposed and alone under the unforgiving glare of the cameras. The cue cards for her speech bore handwriting that Anne didn't recognize, uneven and unfamiliar, as though designed to trip her up. The lighting, she observed, had also been tampered with. Shadows were cast exactly where Charlotte was meant to stand, threatening to swallow her in darkness when the cameras began to roll. At first glance, none of it seemed overt enough to spark outrage, but to Anne's seasoned eye, every detail screamed of manipulation. She'd seen this playbook before, tiny changes meant to disrupt, confuse, and ultimately humiliate. It was the kind of quiet cruelty the palace excelled at. Never enough to accuse anyone outright, but just enough to leave scars. Anne's instincts sharpened with every discovery, her resolve hardening as she watched the pieces fall into place. Decades of royal life had taught her the art of seeing what others ignored, of hearing what others dismissed, and she couldn't ignore the echoes that haunted these halls. The memories of when she herself had been subject to such games, and later, when she had watched Catherine stumble through a similar gauntlet of quiet sabotage. The storm, she knew now, was real, and it was building fast around her innocent niece, a child too young to understand the stakes but old enough to be wounded by them. Anne made her silent vow then and there, her jaw set and her mind unshaken. She would not let this happen. Not to Charlotte. Not again. What began as whispers soon revealed themselves as deliberate cracks in the grand facade. Cracks Anne was determined to seal before anyone noticed. Anne kept her eyes open and her words guarded, watching as the stage was subtly set for disaster. Every corner of the palace seemed to hum with quiet intent, but no one else seemed to notice. That was always the way of these things, subtle enough to be dismissed, yet devastating once their purpose was fulfilled. Anne, however, had learned long ago that silence doesn't mean innocence, so she began to write. In the privacy of her quarters, she opened her diary, the same leather-bound journal that had borne witness to years of royal secrets, and began recording everything she saw. At first, it was nothing more than instinct that drove her to document the oddities. But as the hours passed, the evidence began to pile up like stones in her chest. The cue cards Charlotte would soon read from were marked by unfamiliar handwriting. The letters were tight, irregular, almost hurried, betraying no hint of the graceful calligraphy she knew to expect. Anne could feel her stomach tighten as she imagined how easily a young girl could stumble over foreign words or awkward phrasing in front of countless cameras. Then her attention was drawn upward to the stage itself. The lighting, once soft and balanced, now threw sharp shadows precisely where Charlotte would stand. To most, it might have seemed insignificant, perhaps even unintentional, but Anne recognized the technique. Under the unforgiving glow of those lights, even the calmest child could appear nervous, unsettled, diminished. She scribbled furiously in her diary, noting every adjustment, every silent betrayal that no one else seemed to care about. Her gaze swept the seating chart next, and what she saw nearly made her breath catch. Charlotte, who had been scheduled to sit safely nestled between her parents, had now been placed several seats away alone, exposed to the flashing lenses and the whispers of the crowd. Anne's pen stopped mid-sentence as her fingers curled around the page, her jaw clenching in quiet fury. This was not a mistake. This choreography was deliberate, cruel, and executed with chilling precision. Each revelation built upon the last, confirming what Anne already suspected, but wished she didn't have to believe. This was no accident. It was a calculated setup, crafted not to ruin outright, but to wound just enough for the world to take notice. And as she watched staff members bustle about, oblivious to her piercing gaze, she felt the heavy weight of understanding settle on her shoulders. Someone wanted Charlotte to falter, and as Anne's pen scratched her thoughts on paper, her resolve hardened and she would confront the darkness gathering around her niece. It wasn't just about Charlotte, it was about every royal before her who'd been blindsided by whispers turned into headlines. As Anne sat with her diary open and her thoughts racing, she couldn't help but drift back to those bitter memories that never quite faded. She remembered vividly how Catherine, years earlier, had walked into what was meant to be her moment, radiant and ready, only to find herself swallowed by a chaos she hadn't seen coming. The lighting that washed her out, the seating that isolated her, the notes she'd been handed with words she never rehearsed. Anne had stood by then, watching, her heart clenching, wishing she'd acted sooner. But back then, she'd convinced herself it wasn't her place. That mistake still stung like a fresh wound. Now, with Charlotte on the precipice of her own moment, Anne felt that same storm brewing and knew she couldn't stand idly by again. She'd learned too well that in this family, one stumble was never just a stumble. It became a legend. It became fodder for tabloids, a defining scar written across their image forever. She could see it so clearly, Charlotte faltering under harsh lights, words tumbling into silence, her confidence shattered before it even had the chance to take root. That thought alone drove Anne's pen deeper into the page, her determination etching itself alongside her memories. Palace politics had a cruel habit of circling the youngest, the softest, the least prepared. It wasn't just about power, it was about control. And Charlotte, for all her bright spirit and charm, was still just a child standing in a world that devoured innocence without remorse. That was what Anne could not, and would not allow to happen. Not this time, not while she was watching. Her eyes darted back and forth between the original plans she'd discreetly kept and the altered documents she'd uncovered. The differences grew more unsettling the longer she studied them. Even the smallest adjustments felt laced with intent. The timing of her entrance, now off by just enough to disorient her. The wording on her speech cards subtly changed to include unfamiliar phrases. Piece by piece, it became undeniable. What looked like minor oversights were anything but. With every memory came another clue. And with every clue, Anne's determination grew sharper than ever. She walked alone through the quiet corridors, carrying not anger but undeniable proof in her hands. Each step echoed softly, but the weight behind it was deafening. Anne's expression betrayed nothing, but inside her resolve burned with the kind of quiet fury only years of silence can forge. The palace hummed elsewhere with chatter and movement, but this part of the building seemed frozen in time, the air thick with anticipation. She did not pause, did not glance to either side, because she knew exactly where she was going, and she knew exactly what she needed to say. When she reached the office, she opened the door without knocking. The aide, sitting inside, stiffened at her entrance, his pen hanging mid-air as though caught in guilt before the words could even come. The room was unprepared for her presence, just as he was unprepared for her evidence. She walked forward, steady and unhurried, placing the tampered cue cards and altered event schedule squarely on the polished surface of his desk. The faint sound of paper on wood seemed to crack the silence, but Anne let it linger there, refusing to fill the space with meaningless noise. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes steady and cold, daring him to speak. Then, without raising her voice or softening her tone, she asked, "Is this how you wish to be remembered?" The words dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples of dread across the aide's face. He flinched, blinked, and tried to speak. The first words out of his mouth were a clumsy denial, claiming misunderstanding. But Anne didn't move. Her stillness itself was an accusation. When he tried again, suggesting perhaps an administrative mistake, her silence grew even heavier, pressing down on him like a storm about to break. Each excuse he offered only deepened the pit he was digging himself into. His confidence faltered, and the words began to trip over themselves, each weaker than the last. Anne leaned slightly forward, her gaze cutting through every deflection. The aide's fingers trembled as he shuffled the papers on his desk, avoiding her eyes as though they could burn him where he sat. But she never raised her voice, never demanded a confession, because she didn't need one. The evidence lay before them both, and his guilt was already written in the space between them. With a calm that only made the moment more devastating, she reached out and reclaimed the papers. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Each document returned to her possession, as though removing poison from a wound. When she had gathered everything, she stood upright, her presence towering though she said nothing more. As she turned and walked to the door, the aide remained frozen in his chair. The silence she left behind louder than any accusation. There were no threats, no final words, no need. The damage was already done, and he knew it. With quiet authority, Anne reclaimed the moment, but the hardest part still lay ahead. Anne knew she had one chance to right every wrong before dawn broke over the palace. There would be no second opportunity, no room for hesitation, no safety net if she faltered. The damage, if left unchecked, would unfold mercilessly in front of cameras and headlines, and Charlotte would carry that wound far longer than anyone would dare admit. The palace might not notice the difference, but Anne would. And so, under the veil of night and the quiet shuffle of unseen hours, she set about her work meticulously, unyielding, and determined to erase every trace of sabotage before morning came. She began with the speech. The cue cards that had been doctored, filled with strange phrasing and deliberate pitfalls, were stripped from their folders and replaced with the original set she had preserved. Every word was checked, every line read through her mind, ensuring nothing had been missed. Next, she turned her focus to the seating chart. Without ceremony, she reordered it so that Charlotte would once again be flanked by her parents, surrounded by warmth rather than exposed to scrutiny. Her pen moved quickly, but her thoughts remained sharp. Every mark she made was another act of defiance against the quiet malice that had tried to infiltrate this moment. Anne didn't stop there. She made quiet but decisive calls to 2 staffers, summoning them to new assignments far removed from the event's preparation. No confrontation, no explanation, only a simple reassignment that left them unable to interfere further. Their protests, muted and confused, were met with nothing more than Anne's calm insistence that it was necessary. She knew better than to leave any loose ends. The saboteurs, however subtle, would not have the chance to strike again. Not tonight, not ever. By the time the sun began to rise, the room was immaculate. Everything, the lighting, the notes, the stage, sat exactly as it should have all along, as though the earlier tampering had never existed. No one watching would see the hours of labor that had gone into restoring it. That was precisely the point. The perfection would seem effortless, seamless, and the young girl at the center of it would never know just how close it had all come to unraveling. When Charlotte awoke that morning, the world she stepped into appeared flawless. The cards she received carried her own familiar words. Her seat at the table was exactly where it belonged. The light that fell across the stage was warm and inviting. She walked through it all blissfully unaware of the quiet war that had been waged on her behalf. From behind the curtains, Anne stood motionless, her breath held tight in her chest. Every second felt longer than the last as she waited not for recognition, but for the quiet victory she desperately needed to see. The cameras flashed, the crowd erupted, and Charlotte spoke as if nothing had ever been at stake. Every word rolled from her lips with a quiet authority beyond her years, her poise unshaken, even as hundreds of eyes fixed on her every move. Anne watched from the shadows, her breath still caught somewhere between fear and pride, as the young princess delivered her speech exactly as it had been intended. Calm, graceful, and untouchable. To the outside world, it seemed effortless, a perfect performance by a perfect child. But Anne knew better. With each line, Charlotte spoke. Anne's chest tightened and then loosened again, one quiet beat at a time. The words landed just as they should. The applause swelled at the right moments. The subtle tripwires, planted by unseen hands, had been erased before they could entangle her. Charlotte didn't falter, not even once. And in that moment, the audience and the press alike fell under her spell, their pens and cameras capturing nothing but composure and charm. They whispered among themselves about how remarkable she was, how confident, how ready to carry the weight of her name. Anne, still unseen, reached into her pocket and drew out her diary. She flipped to the page where she had scribbled her fears only hours earlier and began to write over them with quiet relief. Every pause in Charlotte's speech became another note in Anne's hand, every smile another entry. Every moment that passed without incident felt like a victory written in ink, proof of what no one else would ever understand. Then she saw William. He was standing just off to the side, his eyes locked on his daughter with something unspoken shimmering behind them. And when Charlotte stepped down at last, He moved to her without hesitation, scooping her up into his arms and whispering words that only Anne managed to hear. "You were perfect." The crowd cheered louder then, as though echoing his sentiment, but Anne's attention stayed fixed on that single exchange. William's pride glowed as he held his daughter close, oblivious to how narrowly disaster had been averted. He would never know how carefully the stage had been reset for this flawless performance, or how easily it could have shattered under her feet. And as Anne slipped her diary shut, a faint smile tugged at her lips. No one in that grand room would suspect how close everything had come to falling apart, and that was exactly as it should be. The applause roared around her, the cameras kept flashing, and Charlotte stood radiant under the lights. But even in triumph, one question lingered in her mind, a question that wouldn't let her rest. Why didn't she tell William? Even Anne couldn't shake the weight of her own silence. The question pressed on her chest, as the applause faded and the cameras stopped flashing, as Charlotte smiled up at her father, unaware of the danger she had skirted. Anne stood still, hands clasped behind her back, letting the question echo in her mind, because she knew the answer was anything but simple. In the hours leading up to this moment, she had asked herself again and again whether William should have known, whether he had a right to intervene. But each time the thought surfaced, she remembered exactly what was at stake if he had. William was not just a father. He was the future king. And if he'd learned how close Charlotte had come to being humiliated in front of the world, his reaction would have been swift, unmeasured, and impossible to contain. Anne could already hear the confrontation, the furious words flung into quiet corridors, the accusations hurled at aides, the storm that would have swept through the palace. That storm wouldn't have stayed hidden. It would have spilled into the headlines, leaving behind a trail of scandal and division that the family might never recover from. But even more than that, Anne feared what the truth might have done to Charlotte herself. Children carry things differently. If Charlotte learned that someone had needed to step in to protect her, she might start questioning whether she had truly been capable of standing on her own. And Anne knew how fragile confidence could be, how easily it could crumble when doubt took root. The idea of Charlotte believing her success had been anything less than her own was a possibility Anne could not bear to risk. So she chose silence. Not because she didn't trust William, but because she did. She trusted that he would want his daughter to believe in herself more than in any invisible shield around her. She trusted that he would understand, someday, that this was not about secrecy, but about Charlotte's strength. As she stood there in the shadows, she opened her diary and wrote the words she couldn't say aloud. Trust means letting her shine without shadows. She closed the book slowly, her fingers pressing into the cover, as though sealing the promise inside. The weight of her choice remained heavy, but it was hers to bear, and she bore it without regret. Watching William lift his daughter into his arms, whispering words of pride into her ear, Anne felt the edges of her doubt soften. That moment belonged to them, untouched, unblemished, and she would not take it away by revealing what she had done. And as William beamed at his daughter, Anne quietly vowed to carry this secret alone. This wasn't the first time Anne had stood quietly in the shadows, and it wouldn't be the last. As she watched Charlotte bask in her moment of triumph, Anne's mind drifted to memories she never shared with anyone, moments buried so deeply they had become part of her very nature. Years ago, it had been Catherine who stood at the edge of ruin, her introduction to royal life marred by whispers and careful traps that nearly broke her before she'd even begun. Back then, too, Anne had seen the signs, had read the room in a way no one else could, and stepped in to save the day publicly. But to make sure the damage never happened at all, Anne had never asked for thanks. She had never needed the acknowledgement. Her role, she understood now more than ever, was not to stand in the light, but to guard it from the darkness creeping in around the edges. The royal women, especially, seemed to draw these unseen battles, quiet wars, fought not in headlines but in shadows. And time after time, she had found herself there, standing in the breach, ensuring the blows never landed where they were intended. To Anne, true leadership was not about punishment. It was not about delivering speeches, pointing fingers, or turning quiet offenses into loud spectacles. It was about prevention, the kind so seamless that no one even realized it had happened. That, she believed, was power at its most pure. To stop a wound before it could scar, to erase the weapon before it was seen. It was a philosophy she carried into every decision she made, especially that night, when she decided the responsible aides would not be humiliated but quietly moved elsewhere. She made the calls herself, her voice calm but absolute. One was reassigned to a distant office overseas, far from sensitive duties. Another was given a position so innocuous, so removed from the heart of palace affairs, they would never have such an opportunity again. There were no public firings, no gossip to feed the tabloids. The family would wake the next day believing everything had gone as planned. Only Anne knew the truth, and that was enough. When it was over, when the rooms emptied and the palace fell quiet again, she returned to her diary. She wrote everything down with the same precision she always had, not to commemorate her actions, but to remember that vigilance is a duty that never ends. And as she closed her diary that night, she wondered how many more storms lay ahead. One guardian, one vulnerable princess, one future narrowly preserved. But how many more battles go unseen? As Anne stood in the silence after the applause had faded, she could feel the weight of the question pressing against her chest. In a family consumed by spectacle, she had learned to find her place just outside the glare, not in defiance of it, but in quiet resistance to everything it hid. Tonight, Charlotte had shown as though the stage had always been hers, but Anne knew better. Perfection, she understood, was rarely accidental. More often, it was built on struggle, vigilance, and the sacrifices no one ever saw. She wondered then how many others had stood, unnoticed, in those same shadows before her. How many times had interventions like hers changed the course of a royal life without the public ever knowing? How many quiet corrections, how many whispered warnings, had shielded the monarchy from its own fractures? It was easy, she thought, for the world to believe the facade, to believe that the smiles were effortless, that the family moved as one, untouched by malice or doubt. But behind the throne was a story few were allowed to see, and it was never as flawless as it appeared. Even now, with the evening safely behind them, Anne could feel the lingering tension in her shoulders. The cameras had captured perfection, but she could still hear the whispers that had threatened to unravel everything. The public would read tomorrow's headlines and see only confidence and grace. They would never know how close it had come to disaster. And perhaps that was as it should be. Yet part of her wondered whether such illusions did the family justice, whether the true strength of the monarchy lay not in its image, but in the quiet resilience that propped it up from the shadows. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the unsung protectors in every family, in every corner of the world, those who stood watch without acknowledgement, who intervened before the cracks became fractures. Perhaps that was the true legacy she carried. Not the crown, not the applause, but the unseen work that kept the next generation from falling. Perhaps everyone had their own Anne, somewhere, shielding them from storms they'd never even know had gathered. And as the palace lights dimmed that night, Anne's words lingered in her mind, the goal is to prevent the next time. But would it ever truly be enough? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.